Before we descend into one of the Nevada desert's most haunting mysteries, I want to take a moment to thank Luna for suggesting this story. For those of you listening who have your own story suggestions, mysteries that keep you awake at night, cases that deserve deeper investigation, keep them coming. Sleep theories exist because of listeners like Luna, who understand that the best stories aren't always the most famous ones. Sometimes the most compelling mysteries are the ones that slip between the cracks, the cases that don't make national headlines but leave profound questions hanging in the air like desert dust after a storm. The Nevada desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Under the relentless sun, the landscape stretches endlessly, rust-coloured ridges carved by millennia of wind and water, ancient rock formations that rise like sentinels from the valley floor, and shadows that pool in places no map can name. This is a land of extremes, where summer heat climbs past 120 degrees, bending the horizon into shimmering mirages, and winter cold descends with razor precision, cutting through to the bone. It's beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, vast, indifferent, and utterly uncompromising. For those who venture too far off the marked trail, for those who underestimate the harsh mathematics of water and distance and exposure, the desert becomes something else entirely. It becomes a graveyard without headstones. In the autumn of 2014, a hiker named Kenny Veach made a promise to strangers on the internet. He claimed he had found something extraordinary during one of his solo expeditions into the remote wilderness, northeast of Las Vegas, a cave shaped like a perfect capital M, hidden somewhere in the mountains near Nellis Air Force Range. But this wasn't just another cave to add to his extensive catalogue of desert exploration. This one was different. Kenny described stepping through the M-shaped entrance and immediately feeling a vibration so intense, so overwhelming, that his entire body responded with primal terror. The sensation wasn't just physical. It reached deeper, triggering something ancient in his nervous system. The fear was so complete, so absolute, that he did something he had rarely done in all his years of desert hiking. He ran. He fled from the cave and didn't look back. But Kenny Veach was not a man who left mysteries unsolved. He was not someone who accepted defeat easily. He vowed publicly to return with proper camera equipment to document this anomalous cave, to prove that what he experienced was real, to show the world what he had found in that forgotten corner of the Nevada wilderness. Kenny Veach never came back from that second journey. His disappearance set off a search operation that would span weeks, involve helicopters and ground teams, and ultimately yield nothing but questions. What happened to him remains one of the desert's most haunting mysteries, a story that exists at the intersection of wilderness tragedy, internet legend, and unexplained phenomena. Did he simply get lost in treacherous terrain that he had navigated dozens of times before? Did he fall into an unmarked mine shaft, one of the thousands that honeycomb the mountains surrounding Las Vegas, becoming just another victim of the wilderness he knew so intimately? Or did he find the M cave again, and discover something inside it that he wasn't meant to see? This is the story of the M cave, the experienced hiker who searched for it, and the questions that still echo across the empty Nevada desert more than a decade later. It's a story about the thin line between adventure and obsession, about the mysteries that lurk in the unmapped spaces of the American wilderness, and about what happens when someone promises to return and simply vanishes into silence. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Mystery. To understand what happened to Kenny Veach, you first have to understand who he was, not as an internet legend or a missing person case file, but as a real person with a real life who made a conscious choice to walk alone into one of the most unforgiving environments in North America. Kenny Veach was a 47-year-old resident of Las Vegas, Nevada, living in a city famous for its artificial excess just miles from some of the most authentic wilderness remaining in the continental United States. He worked a regular job during the week, but his true passion revealed itself on weekends when he would pack his gear and drive out into the Mojave Desert, into the mountains and valleys that most Las Vegas residents never see, beyond the view from an airplane window. He was what you might call a serious amateur adventurer, someone who had spent years developing the skills, knowledge, and mental fortitude required to explore remote terrain safely and alone. This wasn't casual hiking along maintained trails with other tourists. Kenny specialised in exploring places that didn't appear in guidebooks, abandoned mining operations from the 19th and early 20th centuries, remote cave systems that required scrambling up scree slopes and squeezing through narrow openings, forgotten corners of the desert where the only footprints were his own. His YouTube channel documented these journeys with simple, unadorned videos, long stretches of walking footage, the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel, the whistle of wind through canyons, and Kenny's occasional commentary pointing out interesting geological features or warning about hazards. The people who knew Kenny personally described him as methodical, experienced, and comfortable with solitude in a way that many people never achieve. He wasn't reckless. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He understood the desert's dangers intimately, the way afternoon temperatures could spike without warning, the way a twisted ankle could become a death sentence when you're 15 miles from your vehicle, the way abandoned mine shafts could hide beneath innocent-looking brush, their vertical drops waiting in the darkness. He carried appropriate water, navigation equipment, and emergency supplies. He informed people of his general hiking plans. He had logged hundreds of miles across terrain that would intimidate most experienced hikers. But even the most prepared person can encounter something unexpected. Even the most experienced can misjudge a situation, and even the most confident can stumble across something they don't fully understand. Kenny's YouTube presence was modest. He wasn't trying to build a massive following or monetize his adventures. His channel served primarily as a personal archive, a way to document the places he explored and share them with the small community of fellow desert enthusiasts who appreciated his authentic, no-frills approach. His videos attracted a niche audience: other solo hikers, urban explorers, people fascinated by abandoned mines, and armchair adventurers who enjoyed experiencing remote wilderness from the safety of their homes. In his videos, Kenny came across as calm, observant, and genuinely fascinated by the landscape. He would pan his camera across expansive desert vistas, zoom in on interesting rock formations, and narrate his thoughts in a conversational tone. He talked about the history of old mining claims, speculated about the lives of the prospectors who had worked them, and shared practical advice about navigation and safety. There was no drama, no manufactured suspense, no clickbait titles or thumbnail images. Just a man and the desert he loved. His girlfriend at the time later described him as someone who needed the wilderness the way other people need social interaction. The solitude wasn't isolating for Kenny. It was restorative. The challenges weren't deterrents, they were invitations. The vast emptiness that might trigger anxiety in others brought him peace. This psychological profile is important because it helps explain what happened next. When Kenny encountered something that genuinely frightened him, something that triggered such an intense fear response that he fled, it represented a profound violation of his normal experience. For someone so comfortable in extreme environments, that level of visceral terror must have been deeply unsettling, and perhaps that's why he felt compelled to return. Not despite the fear, but because of it. Chapter 2. The comment that sparked everything. The story that would eventually consume countless hours of internet speculation and real-world search efforts began with something deceptively simple: a comment section on YouTube. In the spring of 2014, months before his disappearance, Kenny Veach was browsing YouTube videos related to hiking and exploration in the Nevada wilderness. He came across a video discussing caves and abandoned sites near the Nellis Air Force Range, the massive restricted military zone that covers roughly 3 million acres of Nevada desert. The video's creator was discussing various interesting geological features and historical sites in the area, and the comment section had evolved into a casual exchange between hikers sharing their own experiences. Kenny posted a comment that seemed unremarkable at first, just another hiker adding his own anecdote to the conversation. But what he described caught people's attention immediately. He wrote that during one of his solo expeditions, he had discovered a cave with an unusual entrance shaped like a capital letter M. The formation wasn't just vaguely M-shaped in the way that rocks sometimes resemble letters if you squint and use your imagination. According to Kenny, this was distinctly, unmistakably M-shaped. 2 clear peaks with a valley between them forming the entrance. That detail alone was intriguing enough to spark curiosity. Natural cave entrances come in all shapes, but such a specific, symmetrical formation would be genuinely unusual. But it was what Kenny described, happening inside the cave, that transformed his comment from mildly interesting to genuinely compelling. He explained that when he approached the M cave and stepped through the entrance, he immediately felt something wrong. There was a vibration. Not a sound he could hear exactly, but something he could feel. It seemed to emanate from the rock itself, a low-frequency oscillation that he sensed more than heard. The sensation was physical, uncomfortable, and deeply unsettling. But more disturbing than the vibration itself was his body's response to it. Kenny described being overwhelmed by an intense primal fear unlike anything he had experienced in all his years of desert exploration. This wasn't the normal caution that comes from navigating dangerous terrain. This wasn't the heightened alertness that kicks in when you encounter a rattlesnake or realise you've lost the trail. This was something far more visceral, a profound, overwhelming terror that seemed to bypass his rational mind entirely and speak directly to something more ancient in his nervous system. The fear was so complete, so consuming, that Kenny did something completely out of character. He turned and ran from the cave. He didn't investigate further. He didn't try to rationalise what he was feeling. He didn't document it with his camera. He simply fled, driven by an instinct that demanded immediate distance from whatever was inside that M-shaped entrance. For someone as experienced and level-headed as Kenny, this reaction was significant. He had explored dozens of caves before. He had descended into abandoned mine shafts where the darkness was absolute and the structural integrity questionable. He had navigated tight passages where getting stuck could mean death. He had handled close encounters with wildlife and managed dangerous terrain in extreme weather. None of it had triggered this kind of response. The comment might have ended there, just another strange story shared online and forgotten. But the internet has a way of latching onto mysteries, and people began responding to Kenny's post with questions. Where exactly was this cave? Could he describe the location more specifically? Why didn't he film it? Would he go back? Kenny engaged with some of these questions, though he remained relatively vague about the precise location. He mentioned it was somewhere in the mountains near Nellis Air Force Range, in the general area of the Sheep Mountains northeast of Las Vegas. He acknowledged that he regretted not filming the cave, explaining that the fear had been so intense that documentation was the last thing on his mind at the time. His only thought had been to get away. But when people pressed him about returning, Kenny made the promise that would seal his fate. He said he would go back. He would find the M cave again. This time he would bring his camera and document everything. He would prove that what he experienced was real. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Forum. Discussions sprouted across multiple platforms. Reddit threads dissected every detail of his description. Amateur investigators began studying satellite imagery of the Sheep Mountains, looking for cave systems that might match. Theories emerged about what could cause such a reaction, everything from natural acoustic phenomena to classified military installations to more exotic explanations. Some commenters were genuinely curious and supportive, eager to see what Kenny would find. Others were skeptical, suggesting he had made the whole thing up for attention or misremembered a normal cave exploration. Still others warned him not to go back, citing either the obvious physical dangers of solo hiking in remote terrain, or more esoteric concerns about disturbing things that should remain undisturbed. Kenny seemed undeterred by either the skeptics or the warnings. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. He would find the M cave, he would document it, he would answer the questions. But as the months passed and Kenny prepared for his return journey, none of the thousands of people following the story could have predicted how it would end. The next time Kenny Veach set out to find the M cave, he would walk into the Nevada desert and never return. The comment section that had started everything would become a digital memorial, the last public words of a man who promised to come back and simply vanished. Chapter 3. public fascination builds. In the months between Kenny's initial comment and his disappearance, the story of the M Cave spread far beyond the original YouTube video where he first mentioned it. What started as a casual exchange in a comment section evolved into a full-blown internet mystery, attracting the attention of hikers, conspiracy theorists, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious observers from around the world. The story had everything that internet communities love: a compelling mystery, an experienced protagonist willing to investigate, a specific promise to deliver proof, and enough ambiguity to fuel endless speculation. Discussion threads multiplied across Reddit, YouTube, hiking forums, and paranormal discussion boards. People dissected every detail of Kenny's original description, analysing his word choices, debating the possible locations, and proposing theories about what might have caused his terrifying experience. The theories fell into several broad categories, each with passionate defenders who believed they had identified the truth behind the M Cave mystery. The military installation theory gained significant traction almost immediately, fueled by the cave's proximity to Nellis Air Force Range. Nellis isn't just any military base, it's one of the most important and secretive military facilities in the United States. The range encompasses roughly 3 million acres of restricted airspace and ground territory, making it larger than the state of Delaware. It's home to the Nevada Test and Training Range, where the Air Force conducts advanced weapons testing and combat training exercises. More controversially, it includes the area known as Groom Lake, better recognised by its popular name, Area 51. The history of secret government activities in the Nevada desert is not paranoid fantasy, it's documented fact. From the 1950s through the early 1990s, the US government conducted over 900 nuclear weapons tests at the Nevada test site, many of them underground. These tests created massive subsurface caverns and tunnel systems, some of which remain classified. The area has also been used for testing advanced aircraft, weapons systems, and other classified military technologies. Enormous underground facilities were constructed to support these operations, their true extent known only to those with the highest security clearances. Given this context, the theory that Kenny's M Cave might be connected to classified military infrastructure wasn't completely absurd. Proponents argued that the vibration he felt could have been machinery, ventilation systems, generators, or other equipment operating in underground facilities. The fear response could have been his subconscious, recognising that he had stumbled onto something dangerous, somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The perfect M shape of the entrance could be deliberate rather than natural, an engineered access point designed to blend with the surrounding geology. Some took the theory further, suggesting that if Kenny had indeed found an entrance to a classified facility, and then publicly announced his intention to return and film it, he might have attracted unwanted official attention. Could his disappearance have been not an accident but an intervention? The theory was dramatic, perhaps even paranoid, but the government's documented history of extreme secrecy around Nevada desert installations meant it couldn't be dismissed out of hand. The natural phenomenon theory offered a less conspiratorial but equally intriguing explanation. This hypothesis focused on a well-documented scientific phenomenon called infrasound, sound waves with frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. While humans cannot consciously hear infrasound, their bodies can detect it, and the effects can be profound and disturbing. Studies have shown that exposure to certain infrasound frequencies can trigger a range of unsettling physical and psychological responses, feelings of dread or terror, nausea, disorientation, visual disturbances that might be interpreted as hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense that something is wrong, even when no obvious danger is present. These effects occur because infrasound can cause resonance in various parts of the human body, including the chest cavity and eyeballs, creating sensations that the brain interprets as external threats. Infrasound occurs naturally in certain environments. Wind passing through specific cave, geometries can generate low-frequency oscillations. Seismic activity produces infrasound waves. Even certain weather patterns can create these frequencies. If the M Cave had a unique shape that amplified and focused infrasound generated by wind or geological processes, It could explain both the vibration Kenny felt and his intense fear response. This theory had the advantage of being testable and grounded in established science. Researchers have replicated infrasound effects in laboratory settings and documented their occurrence in natural environments. The famous haunted reputation of certain buildings and locations has been attributed to infrasound generated by ventilation systems or structural resonances. If Kenny's experience was caused by infrasound, it would explain why the fear felt so irrational and overwhelming. His conscious mind knew there was no visible threat, but his body was responding to something real, just not something he could see or consciously hear. The geological anomaly theory proposed that unusual mineral compositions or electromagnetic phenomena might be responsible. Certain rock formations contain high concentrations of magnetite or other ferromagnetic materials that can create localized magnetic field anomalies. These fields can potentially affect human perception, spatial orientation, and even mood. Some researchers have suggested that exposure to certain electromagnetic frequencies might trigger fear responses or other psychological effects. This theory gained support from documented cases of people reporting unusual sensations in areas with known magnetic anomalies. The idea was that Kenny, who had explored many caves without incident, might have encountered a geological formation with properties that affected his neurological function in unexpected ways. The vibration he felt could have been a subjective sensation created by his nervous system responding to electromagnetic stimulation rather than an actual physical oscillation. The paranormal theories inevitably emerged as well, though they existed in the more speculative corners of the discussion. Some suggested the cave might be a portal or dimensional thin spot, whatever that might mean. Others proposed that Kenny had encountered something supernatural or otherworldly. These theories were less concerned with scientific plausibility and more focused on the numerous unexplained disappearances and strange phenomena reported in remote wilderness areas. While mainstream discussants generally dismissed the paranormal angle, it persisted in certain communities, adding another layer to the growing mythology around the M Cave. The vagueness of these theories, their resistance to falsification, made them impossible to disprove, which in turn made them attractive to those inclined towards supernatural explanations. As these theories circulated and evolved, they created an atmosphere of anticipation. People weren't just curious about whether Kenny would find the cave again. They had invested in various explanations and were eager to see which would be validated. Amateur investigators studied topographical maps and satellite imagery, trying to identify likely locations. Some even planned their own expeditions to search for the M Cave independently. YouTube channels began discussing the mystery, bringing the story to even wider audiences. Comment sections filled with armchair detectives sharing their theories and analyses. Some people expressed concern for Kenny's safety, warning him about the dangers of solo hiking in remote areas. Others encouraged him, expressing excitement about seeing the footage he would bring back. Kenny himself remained relatively quiet during this period, occasionally responding to comments but not engaging deeply with the speculation. He seemed focused on preparing for the return journey rather than debating theories. He mentioned gathering better camera equipment to properly document whatever he found. He refined his understanding of where the cave was located, studying his mental map of the area and planning his route. As summer faded into autumn, the anticipation reached a peak. Kenny had committed to making the journey. The internet was watching, waiting for the proof that would finally answer the question, what was inside the M Cave? But the answer, when it came, would be the most disturbing possibility of all. Silence. Chapter 4. The Final Hike. November. 2014 arrived with the kind of weather that makes the Nevada desert tolerable for extended hiking. Cooler temperatures, lower humidity, gentler sun. This is peak season for desert exploration, when the brutal summer heat has passed but winter's occasional storms haven't yet arrived. Kenny Veach had hiked in these mountains dozens of times, familiar with the seasonal patterns, the way afternoon shadows lengthen across the valleys, the reliable landmarks that guide you back to civilization. On a Saturday morning in early November, Kenny prepared for what he told his girlfriend would be another solo hiking expedition into the Sheep Mountains. This range, located northeast of Las Vegas, is part of the larger Desert National Wildlife Refuge, though refuge is perhaps a misleading term for such harsh terrain. The Sheep Mountains are characterized by steep rocky slopes, deep canyons, extreme elevation changes, and a landscape that seems designed to punish human intrusion. The range rises abruptly from the desert floor, its highest peaks reaching nearly 10,000 feet. The terrain is a chaotic mixture of limestone cliffs, loose talus slopes, narrow canyons carved by occasional flash floods, and countless cave openings, both natural formations and abandoned mine shafts from mining operations that date back more than a century. Vegetation is sparse: creosote bush, desert scrub, the occasional juniper clinging to protected slopes. Water is virtually non-existent except immediately after rare rainstorms. This is not forgiving country. It's the kind of place where a small mistake can cascade into catastrophe, where getting turned around can mean miles of additional hiking through increasingly unfamiliar terrain, where a fall on loose rock can leave you injured and immobile with no possibility of help arriving, unless someone knows exactly where to look. But Kenny knew all this. He had been here many times before. He understood the risks and respected them. That morning, he packed his gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it hundreds of times. Water, more than he expected to need. Energy food, first aid supplies, emergency gear, navigation tools, and his camera equipment. He was planning to document the M Cave, to finally provide the proof he had promised months earlier. He told his girlfriend his general destination, the Sheep Mountains area, but didn't specify an exact location. This was normal for Kenny. He liked to keep his exploration routes somewhat flexible, following his instincts and the terrain rather than rigid, predetermined paths. He expected to be gone for the day, returning before dark. It was a routine solo expedition, no different from dozens of others he had completed safely. Kenny drove north from Las Vegas, following State Route 93 toward the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. The drive takes you through increasingly remote country, past the last gas stations and convenience stores, into a landscape that seems to exist outside of human time. He would have turned onto one of the rough dirt roads that branch off the highway, navigating toward his chosen trailhead. These roads are unmaintained, winding through desert scrub, sometimes barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. He parked his vehicle at a known trailhead area, a location he'd used before, where there's enough cleared space to leave a car and where the terrain transitions from merely difficult to genuinely challenging. This detail would later prove crucial. His vehicle was found exactly where he had left it, showing that Kenny had returned to this specific spot at the end of previous hikes. He knew the way back. He had landmarks. This was familiar territory. From the trailhead, Kenny would have set out on foot, carrying his pack, camera in hand, heading into the broken country of ridges and canyons that characterized the Sheep Mountains. Exactly which direction he went, which route he chose, which specific cave entrance he was searching for, all of this remains unknown. The Nevada wilderness doesn't provide convenient surveillance, doesn't track your movements, doesn't record your path. What we know is this: Kenny Veach walked into the Sheep Mountains on a November morning with the intention of finding a specific cave, documenting it, and returning before nightfall. He never came back. When darkness fell and Kenny hadn't returned, his girlfriend's concern grew. One night became two. By Monday, when Kenny still hadn't appeared and wasn't responding to phone calls, she contacted authorities to report him missing. The clock had started on what would become an extensive search operation, and one of the most puzzling missing person cases in Nevada wilderness history. Chapter 5: The Search Effort. When Kenny Veach was officially reported missing, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department initiated contact with the appropriate search and rescue organizations. In Nevada, wilderness search and rescue operations are typically coordinated by the County Sheriff's Department in cooperation with volunteer search and rescue teams, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and when necessary, the Civil Air Patrol and National Guard. The Sheep Mountains present extraordinary challenges for search operations. The terrain is vast, vertical and unforgiving. Unlike searches in forested areas where ground teams can maintain visual contact and relatively straight search lines, the desert mountains are fragmented into countless canyons, ridges, cliffs and isolated pockets that must be checked individually. A person could be 100 yards away and completely invisible, hidden in a canyon or behind a rock formation. From the air, the monochromatic landscape makes it difficult to spot anything human-sized unless you know exactly where to look. Search teams arrived at the trailhead where Kenny's vehicle was found. The car provided a clear starting point. Kenny had definitely been here, had parked intentionally, and had set out on foot. But from that point, he could have gone in virtually any direction. The Sheep Mountains sprawl across miles of wilderness. Without a specific destination or planned route, the search area was enormous. Ground teams began systematic searches of the most likely areas, established trails, known cave locations, popular hiking routes. They called Kenny's name, listened for responses, looked for any signs of recent human passage. In rocky desert terrain, footprints are hard to find except in sandy washes or particularly soft ground. Kenny was experienced enough to stay mostly on solid rock when possible, which means he likely left minimal tracks. Search and rescue volunteers are often experienced hikers themselves, people who understand the terrain and the mindset of those who explore it. They checked water sources. Even though water is scarce in the Sheep Mountains, there are a few springs and seasonal seeps that hikers might navigate toward if becoming desperate. They investigated abandoned mine shafts, many of which are unmarked and hidden by brush or collapsed debris. These shafts represent some of the most dangerous features of Nevada wilderness. Vertical drops of hundreds of feet, unstable walls, toxic gases accumulated over decades. If Kenny had fallen into an unmarked shaft, recovery would be difficult and dangerous. Helicopter searches provided aerial coverage of vast areas that would take weeks to cover on foot. Search and rescue. Helicopters flew grid patterns across the likely search zones, observers scanning the ground for any sign of Kenny or his gear. They looked for bright colours that might indicate clothing or equipment, for unusual shapes that might be a body, for any disturbance that might signal someone trying to signal for help. But the desert is a study in camouflage. Rocks look like packs, shadows look like caves. Natural formations create patterns that the human eye wants to interpret as meaningful, and a person lying still, whether injured, sheltering or deceased, can be extraordinarily difficult to spot from the air unless they're in an open area. Days became a week. The search continued. Volunteers hiked into increasingly remote canyons. They checked caves, investigated reported sightings that turned out to be nothing, followed up on every possible lead. The Civil Air Patrol conducted extended aerial searches. The effort was thorough, professional and extensive, but the Sheep Mountains kept their secret. No trace of Kenny Veach was found, no abandoned pack, no discarded water bottles, no torn clothing caught on bushes, no footprints in sandy washes, no body, no gear, nothing. This absence of evidence was itself deeply puzzling. Even in fatal wilderness accidents, searchers typically find something. Equipment dropped during a fall, clothing shed due to hypothermia-induced confusion, some indication of where the person went or what happened to them. The complete absence of any trace suggested either that Kenny had travelled far outside the expected search area, or that something unusual had occurred. The search teams expanded their range, checking even more remote locations. They investigated reports from other hikers who thought they might have seen someone matching Kenny's description, though these sightings proved unreliable. They revisited areas already searched, acknowledging that it's easy to miss things even when looking carefully. As the days stretched into 2 weeks, the probability of finding Kenny alive diminished towards 0. Even in November, the desert presents serious survival challenges. Water is the critical factor. Humans can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. Kenny had carried water, but not enough for extended survival. If he was injured and unable to move, exposure would have become a factor. Even in relatively mild November weather, desert nights drop below freezing at higher elevations. The search didn't discover any evidence suggesting what had happened. Had Kenny fallen? Possibly, though no blood, torn fabric or other signs of trauma were found at cliff bases or in likely fall zones. Had he become disoriented and wandered outside the search area? Possible, but Kenny was experienced and knew the general area well. Had he encountered a medical emergency like a heart attack or stroke? Possible, but even then, his body should have been somewhere findable. After weeks of intensive searching involving hundreds of volunteer hours, helicopter flights, ground teams, and systematic coverage of the most probable areas, the search effort was officially scaled back. This didn't mean abandonment. Missing person cases remain open indefinitely, and new information or evidence can always trigger renewed efforts. But the active, intensive phase of the search concluded without resolution. Kenny Veach's case was classified as a missing person investigation with suspected accidental death in wilderness terrain. Without a body or definitive evidence of what occurred, however, it remained fundamentally unsolved. His vehicle was processed for evidence, but yielded nothing suspicious. His personal effects were returned to family. The trailhead where he parked became, for a time, a place where people left notes and small memorials. Others who had followed his story online, who felt connected to his disappearance, who hoped that somehow he might still return. He never did. The official conclusion, though never definitely proven, was that Kenny had suffered some kind of accident in remote terrain. A fall into an unseen crevasse, perhaps, or a medical emergency in a location where his body remained hidden among the countless rocks and canyons. The Sheep Mountains had simply absorbed him, the way they've absorbed others before and will again. But for those who had followed Kenny's story from the beginning, for those who remembered his promise to find and document the M Cave, the official explanation felt incomplete. Too many questions remained unanswered, and the search for answers was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Last Footage. Among Kenny's recovered possessions was his cell phone, found inside his vehicle at the trailhead. For investigators, and for those following the case online, this phone represented the most likely source of answers. If Kenny had recorded anything during his final hike, if he had documented finding the M Cave, if there were any clues about what happened to him, they would be on this device. Authorities examined the phone carefully, looking through his photos, videos, messages, and any other data that might provide insight into his plans or his fate. What they found was both revealing and frustratingly incomplete. There was video on the phone, footage from what appeared to be Kenny's final hiking expedition. When this video was eventually described to the public, authorities did not release the actual footage, considering it part of an active investigation and private to Kenny's family. It showed Kenny hiking through familiar-looking desert terrain in the Sheep Mountains area. The footage was unremarkable in almost every way. Kenny appeared calm, focused, moving with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The video showed typical desert mountain landscape, rocky terrain, sparse vegetation, distant ridgelines. Kenny occasionally panned the camera across the scenery, the kind of documentation he regularly did on his hikes. His breathing sounded normal, not laboured. His movements appeared steady and controlled. There were no audible signs of distress, no indication that he was lost or in trouble. Most critically, the video showed no cave, no M-shaped entrance, no mysterious vibrations, no fearful reaction. The footage simply showed Kenny hiking through the mountains, apparently searching but not finding what he was looking for, or at least not filming it if he did. The video ended without drama or revelation. Kenny was simply walking, filming the landscape, and then the recording stopped. What happened after that final frame remains unknown. For investigators, this footage raised more questions than it answered. Several possibilities emerged. Possibility 1. Kenny never found the M Cave on this trip. He searched but was unable to relocate it. Perhaps his memory of its location was less precise than he thought. Perhaps the terrain looked different enough, that he couldn't identify the right canyon or ridge. Perhaps the cave entrance was more obscured than he remembered. A rockfall could have altered the landscape. Vegetation could have grown. Perspective from a different approach angle could make familiar features unrecognisable. In this scenario, Kenny might have spent hours searching unsuccessfully, ventured into increasingly remote or hazardous terrain while looking, and ultimately met with some accident completely unrelated to the M cave itself. Possibility 2. Kenny did find the M cave but didn't film his approach to it. Perhaps he wanted to scout it first, to gather his courage after the fear he experienced on his first encounter. Perhaps he planned to film the exterior and interior separately, taking time to prepare for proper documentation. Perhaps he entered the cave and the vibrational fear or some other factor caused him to forget about or abandon the camera. In this scenario, whatever happened to Kenny happened in or near the M cave, but no visual record exists. Possibility 3. Kenny found something he decided not to record, or something happened that prevented recording. This opens darker speculation. If the M cave was connected to classified military installations and Kenny recognised official warnings or infrastructure, he might have wisely chosen not to create evidence of trespassing. Or if he encountered some kind of danger or threatening situation, documenting it might have been the last thing on his mind. Possibility 4. The most mundane explanation. Kenny's phone battery died, his storage filled up, or he simply stopped recording to conserve power or space, planning to resume filming later when he found something worth documenting. Then he encountered whatever misfortune befell him without the camera running. The phone data also revealed something else. No distress calls, no emergency text messages, no attempt to contact anyone after he began his hike. This suggested that whatever happened to Kenny happened relatively quickly, giving him no time or opportunity to call for help. A sudden fall, a rapid onset medical emergency, or some other acute incident that incapacitated him before he could reach his phone. For those who had followed Kenny's story online, the lack of M cave footage was profoundly disappointing and unsettling. He had promised documentation. He had committed to proving what he experienced. The fact that the last video showed nothing unusual seemed almost cruel, like a story cut off mid-sentence, a promise unfulfilled. Some questioned whether the authorities were telling the full truth about the phone's contents. Conspiracy theorists suggested that if the footage did show something sensitive, a military installation, classified infrastructure, something the government didn't want public, it would be suppressed. These theories were unprovable and arguably paranoid, but in the absence of closure, they persisted. What's certain is this. Kenny Veach's last documented moments show him doing exactly what he loved, exploring the Nevada wilderness, camera in hand, searching for something that fascinated him. And then, somewhere beyond the final frame of that video, he disappeared. The phone, which might have been his lifeline or his means of documenting what he found, sat silent in his vehicle while he vanished into the mountains. Its last footage became an unintentional memorial, the final visual record of a man who walked into mystery and never returned. Chapter 7. The official conclusion. As weeks turned to months with no new evidence, Kenny Veach's case followed the sad trajectory of thousands of missing person cases in America's wilderness areas. The intensive search phase concluded. The case remained officially open but moved into inactive status, meaning no ongoing active investigation unless new evidence emerged. Resources shifted to other emergencies, other missing persons, other priorities. The official determination, while never formalised as absolute certainty without a body, leaned heavily toward accidental death in wilderness terrain. This conclusion was based on several factors that investigators considered persuasive. The terrain itself. The Sheep Mountains are extraordinarily hazardous. Countless ways exist for an experienced hiker to meet with fatal misfortune. Unstable rock causing falls, hidden mine shafts dropping hundreds of feet into darkness, narrow canyons that become death traps during flash floods, dehydration and exposure even in relatively mild weather. Nevada's wilderness claims lives with depressing regularity. Experienced hikers die in these mountains. Local knowledge and careful preparation reduce risk but cannot eliminate it. The area contains literally thousands of abandoned mine shafts, most unmapped and unmarked, many hidden by brush or partial collapse. These shafts were dug during mining booms spanning from the 1860s through the mid-1900s. They descend vertically into bedrock, their depths varying from 20 feet to more than 1,000 feet. Many have accumulated toxic gases, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, methane, that can render a person unconscious in seconds. A hiker stepping on what appears to be solid ground could crash through a rotten timber covering and fall into oblivion. The shafts are so numerous and so scattered that comprehensive mapping is impossible, the absence of evidence of foul play. Nothing suggested that Kenny had been the victim of crime. His vehicle was undisturbed, his possessions were intact. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses reporting suspicious activity, no evidence of anyone else being involved. While it's theoretically possible that someone could encounter violence in remote wilderness, it's statistically far less likely than simple accident. The statistical probability: people disappear in wilderness areas at a rate that most Americans would find shocking. The National Park Service alone investigates hundreds of missing person cases annually, with dozens remaining permanently unsolved. When you expand beyond national parks to include all wilderness areas, state lands, national forests and Bureau of Land Management property, the numbers grow substantially. Many of these disappearances are eventually attributed to falls, exposure, getting lost, medical emergencies, or other natural causes, even when bodies are never recovered. Kenny's profile: solo hikers face elevated risk by definition. If something goes wrong, an injury, sudden illness, disorientation, there's no partner to help, to go for assistance, to provide a second perspective on navigation. Kenny's preference for solo exploration, while understandable and legitimate, meant he was operating without the safety margin that a hiking partner provides. For authorities, this combination of factors made accidental death the most probable explanation. The lack of a body was disappointing, but not particularly unusual in such terrain. Bodies can be hidden in crevasses, buried in rockfalls, obscured by vegetation, or concealed in any of the thousands of possible hiding places the mountains provide. Search efforts, no matter how extensive, cannot cover every square foot of such vast, vertical, complex terrain. The case would remain in the files, ready to be reopened if new evidence emerged, if hikers stumbled across remains, if someone came forward with information, if anything changed. But absent such developments, it entered the limbo of unsolved wilderness disappearances. For Kenny's family and friends, this lack of closure was agonizing. Without a body, without definitive answers, the grief process remains complicated, suspended in uncertainty. The official conclusion provided a probable explanation but not proof, a hypothesis but not resolution. And for the thousands who had followed Kenny's story online, who had read his promise to find and document the M-Cave, the official explanation felt profoundly unsatisfying. Yes, accidents happen. Yes, the wilderness is dangerous. Yes, people die on solo hikes. But the specific circumstances, Kenny's experience, his public promise, his disappearance precisely when attempting to fulfill that promise, created a narrative that resisted simple explanations. The human mind craves patterns, seeks meaning, and struggles with coincidence. The fact that Kenny disappeared while searching for a specific cave that had frightened him, after publicly announcing his intention to find it, felt significant in a way that couldn't be entirely dismissed as selective attention bias. The official case might be inactive, but the unofficial investigation, the crowdsourced effort to understand what happened, was just beginning to accelerate. Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps more than you could possibly know and makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Alright, let's get into tonight's investigation. The file sat in his hands like a live grenade. Evan Hartley had been working at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland for 8 months. It was June of 1998, a Thursday afternoon that had started like every other. The archive facility was a massive concrete structure that housed billions of documents, the collective memory of American government stretching back centuries. Hartley worked in Section 7, a climate-controlled vault 3 floors below ground level, where the most sensitive to classified materials were processed before being made available to researchers. His job was simple, if tedious. Sort through newly declassified intelligence records, catalogue them according to the established system, and prepare them for public access. Box after box of Cold War-era documents, most of them mundane reports about Soviet grain production or diplomatic cable traffic. Some were fascinating glimpses into the machinery of espionage, but none of them had ever felt dangerous before. Until he opened the mislabeled Defense Intelligence Agency container, the box was one of 20 that had arrived that morning from a storage facility in Pennsylvania. Hartley had already processed 9 of them without incident. Standard wartime logistics documentation, exactly what the label promised. Requests for boots, fuel, ammunition, medicine, the mundane necessities of keeping an army in the field. But box number 10 was different. Inside, beneath 3 inches of actual supply requisitions that seemed authentic enough, was a folder that didn't belong. The folder itself was unremarkable, standard government issue manila, slightly yellowed with age, but the tab bore a label that made Hartley's pulse quicken. Paperclip-classified supplement-not for release. He set down his coffee cup and pulled the folder out carefully as if it might crumble at his touch. The weight felt wrong. Too heavy for just a few documents. His hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly. Everyone knew about Operation Paperclip. It was the famous program that brought German scientists to America after World War II, the one that gave us Wernher von Braun and the space program. Hartley had processed paperclip documents before. They were fascinating historical artifacts, and most of them had been declassified, years ago. Researchers came from around the world to study them. But this was marked as classified, decades after most paperclip files had been opened to researchers, decades after the program itself had officially ended. The archive was quiet around him. The only sound was the low hum of the climate control system, and the occasional distant footstep from the hallway above. Hartley glanced toward the security camera in the corner of the room. Its red light blinked steadily, recording everything as always. He opened the folder carefully. The first item was a black and white photograph, slightly faded but clear enough. The edges were crisp, professionally developed. Government photography from the post-war period had a distinctive quality, and this matched it perfectly. The photo showed Wernher von Braun, unmistakable with his sharp features and confident smile, standing in what appeared to be a military office. Von Braun wore civilian clothes, a dark suit and tie. Standing with him were 3 men in United States Army uniforms. 2 wore the insignia of colonels. The third, standing slightly apart from the others, wore captain's bars but no unit designation that Hartley could identify. But these weren't the officers usually photographed with von Braun. Hartley had seen hundreds of paperclip photographs during his months in the archives. He had studied the key figures, memorized their faces. These 3 men were completely unfamiliar. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil in a neat hand, Fort Strong's Secure Facility, July 1947, Eclipse Preliminary Briefing. Hartley felt his mouth go dry. Fort Strong was a real place, an army installation in Massachusetts. but he had never encountered any reference to Eclipse in connection with paperclip. The second item made his stomach tighten into a knot. It was a typed list on official War Department letterhead, dated August 1947. German names, 23 of them, each with a birth date and a field of specialization listed beside them. Hartley ran his fingers down the list slowly. He recognized none of the names, not one, and he had studied the paperclip rosters extensively. Every historian working on the program used the same master lists, compiled from multiple sources over decades of research. These names appeared on none of them. The specializations were unusual too, not rocket science or aeronautical engineering. Instead, he saw entries like neurological field manipulation, bioelectromagnetic interface systems, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation, psychotronic weapons development, non-local consciousness research. Beside each name was a handwritten notation in red ink: Cat 2 Specialist, Category 2. Hartley had never encountered that designation in any paperclip documentation. The third document was a memorandum on Office of Strategic Services letterhead, dated October 21st, 1947. The header read, Project Eclipse, dash continuation protocols and security requirements. The text was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic style of military intelligence. Eclipse researchers will continue where the Reich left off. Subjects must remain off record. Scientific potential outweighs public risk. Transfer to designated facilities to proceed under compartmentalized oversight. Category 2, specialists to remain separated from NASA track personnel at all times. No cross-program communication authorized. Standard paperclip documentation procedures do not apply to Eclipse subjects. All records to be maintained separately from main paperclip archive. Classification level to exceed top secret. Access restricted to need-to-know basis as determined by Oversight Committee. It was signed at the bottom in a strong angular hand. William J. Donovan, Major General, United States Army. Hartley felt his hands begin to shake. He set the memo down and stared at the signature. William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary spy chief, the man who had founded the Office of Strategic Services, America's first centralized intelligence agency, and led it through World War II. One of the most decorated soldiers in American history, a man who had won the Medal of Honor in World War I. But Donovan had retired from government service after the war. President Truman had disbanded the OSS in 1945, and Donovan had returned to his law practice in New York. Everyone knew that story. It was in every history book. So why was he signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? Hartley turned to the final page in the folder. It was a single sheet, heavier stock paper with text that had been stamped rather than typed. The stamps were in red ink, bold and unmistakable. Program status, terminated. Civilian access, prohibited. Research continuation, off-site. Classification level, permanent. Destruction of records, forbidden. Archive protocol, Eclipse Vault only. The date stamp read, May 18th, 1953. Below the stamps, in the same handwriting as the October 47 memo, was a single sentence. Incident containment complete. All surviving personnel reassigned. Eclipse Continuity Division assumes oversight. Hartley sat back in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The documents were spread before him on the sorting table, innocuous pieces of paper that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. He knew he should take them to his supervisor. Protocol was clear. Anything unusual, anything that seemed misclassified or particularly sensitive, went through proper channels. That was the rule. But something stopped him. Some instinct, some voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "Once you hand this over, you'll never see it again. No one will. These documents will disappear, and it will be as if they never existed." The thought made him feel paranoid, which bothered him. Hartley prided himself on being rational, methodical. He wasn't prone to conspiracy thinking. He trusted the system, trusted the process. That was why he had taken this job in the first place. But the documents in front of him didn't feel like history. They felt like something alive, something dangerous, something that people might kill to keep hidden. He was still debating what to do, his mind racing through possibilities, when he heard the door to the archive room open behind him. Hartley jumped, his hand instinctively moving to cover the documents. He turned in his chair. 2 men entered. They wore dark suits, conservative cuts, nothing flashy. White shirts, dark ties. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine. One was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with grey at the temples and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime in military or government service. His face was weathered but expressionless, eyes that took in everything without revealing anything. The other was younger, perhaps 30, athletic and alert. He moved with the controlled grace of someone trained in hand-to-hand combat. His eyes scanned the room with professional efficiency, noting exits, angles, positioning. They didn't belong here. Hartley had worked in the archives long enough to recognise the types who came through. Historians, researchers, journalists, sometimes military personnel following up on specific records. These men were something else. "Mr. Hartley," the older man said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a flat tone that expected no response. Hartley felt his throat tighten. "Yes? We need to collect some materials that were incorrectly included in your batch today." The man's eyes went to the folder on the table, to the document spread beside it. That one, specifically, and any others from the same container. His voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. Not quite a threat, but an absolute certainty. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Hartley felt his throat go dry. His mind raced. "Who are you? I need to see authorization before I can release any materials." "Office of Special Investigations." The older man produced a credentials wallet from his inner jacket pocket, flipped it open with practiced ease. The badge looked legitimate, the photo matched his face. The younger man did the same, but Hartley barely looked at them. His eyes were fixed on the younger man, who had moved with subtle efficiency to flank the sorting table, positioning himself between Hartley and the door. The movement had been casual, almost invisible, but its purpose was clear. "This folder was in a declassified container," Hartley said, hearing the tremor in his own voice and hating it. "It was marked for public release. According to the transfer documentation, everything in that box has been through proper review channels. It's part of the public record now." "No," the older man said simply. His tone didn't change. "It's not." He stepped forward and reached for the folder. Hartley's hand moved instinctively to stop him, but something in the man's eyes made him freeze. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator, calm, patient, but absolutely ready to act. The older man gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, sliding them back into the folder in the same order Hartley had found them. The photograph, the list, the memo, the final page. His movements were careful, respectful of the materials, but completely confident. This was not the first time he had retrieved classified documents. "You never saw this file," the man said, looking directly into Hartley's eyes. The folder disappeared into his briefcase with a soft click of the latch. "Do you understand me? You never saw it. It was never in that box. This conversation never happened." Hartley wanted to protest, wanted to assert his rights as an archivist, as a federal employee, as a citizen. He wanted to demand proper documentation, to insist on following protocols. He wanted to ask 100 questions about what those documents meant, why they were classified, what Project Eclipse had been. But the look in the man's eyes stopped him cold. This was not a request. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of authority that came from somewhere far above the pay grade of a junior archivist. "I understand," Hartley heard himself say. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking. The older man nodded once, a brief acknowledgement. Then he turned to his companion. "Check the box. Make sure there's nothing else." The younger man moved to the container Hartley had been processing. He lifted out the remaining supply requisitions with quick, expert hands, checking each page before setting it aside. His movements were methodical, thorough. He found nothing else unusual. "Clear," he said. The older man looked back at Hartley one final time. "You seem like a smart man, Mr. Hartley. Smart enough to understand that some things are classified for good reasons. Some things need to stay buried. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the alternative would be worse. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Hartley nodded. He wasn't sure he did understand, but nodding seemed like the safest response. "Good." The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but something less threatening. "Go back to your work. Finish processing the rest of these boxes. Nothing unusual happened today. You found exactly what you expected to find. Supply requisitions from the European theatre. Nothing more." The two men left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like a vault sealing shut. Hartley sat alone in the archive room for a long time after they were gone. The table in front of him was empty now, just. The ordinary supply requisitions spread across its surface. The folder was gone. The photograph, the list, the memo, the termination order, all of it gone as if it had never existed. His hands were still shaking. He noticed that his coffee had gone cold, a film forming across the surface. The security camera in the corner continued its steady blinking, recording an empty room where nothing unusual had happened. Nothing at all. Hartley looked at his watch. 3:17 in the afternoon. He still had 2 hours left in his shift, 9 more boxes to process. He pulled the next container toward him and opened it mechanically. More supply requisitions, boots and fuel and ammunition. The mundane logistics of war. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. He never told anyone what he had seen that day, not his supervisor, who asked at the end of the shift if everything had gone smoothly. Not his colleagues during lunch breaks. Not his wife when he got home that evening and she asked about his day. He finished his shift, checked out at the security desk, drove home through the late afternoon traffic of suburban Maryland, and tried to forget. But he never did forget. The documents haunted him. The names on that list. The strange specializations. Project Eclipse. The signature of a dead man on documents that should not exist. And 20 years later, when he was finally old enough, and angry enough, and brave enough to break his silence, he would tell his story to a researcher investigating Operation Paperclip, and he would add one final detail that he had noticed in that brief, terrible moment before the documents disappeared. The older man who had taken the folder had a name tag on his briefcase, one of those leather luggage tags that people use when travelling, just visible for a moment as he closed it and prepared to leave. It read, Eclipse Continuity Division, Act 1, The History They Admit. To understand what Evan Hartley may have stumbled upon in that archive room in June of 1998, we need to start with what we know for certain, the acknowledged history, the version that sits in textbooks and documentaries, the story that has been told and retold until it feels like settled fact. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had endured for exactly 12 years and 4 months. As Allied forces swept through German territory in the final weeks of the war, they discovered something that would change the course of the 20th century. The Nazis had been far ahead of everyone else in certain areas of scientific research. Jet engines that could propel aircraft at unprecedented speeds, ballistic missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, rocket technology that pointed toward the stars, advanced aeronautics that made Allied aircraft look primitive by comparison. The V-2 rocket, which had rained terror on London and Antwerp in the final year of the war, represented a quantum leap in engineering. Standing nearly 50 feet tall and weighing over 28,000 pounds at launch, it could carry a 1-ton warhead across a distance of 200 miles, faster than the speed of sound, striking without warning from the edge of space itself. It was the world's first ballistic missile, and the Allies had nothing remotely like it. The Germans had also made advances in fields ranging from synthetic fuels to infrared optics to wind tunnel design. Some of this was practical engineering that could immediately be applied to military and civilian purposes. Some of it was theoretical work that would take years to fully understand and implement, and the scientists who had built all of this were now up for grabs. The United States Army began a frantic operation to locate and secure German scientists before the Soviets could get to them. Special intelligence teams, organised under a program initially called Operation Overcast, fanned out across occupied Germany. They followed leads from captured documents, interviewed prisoners of war, tracked down research facilities that had been hastily abandoned in the final chaos of the Nazi collapse. They found treasures beyond imagination, hidden laboratories carved into mountains, underground factories where slave labourers had assembled rockets while bombs fell overhead, filing cabinets stuffed with technical drawings and experimental data, and scientists, hundreds of them, eager to trade their expertise for safety in America or Britain, or anywhere that wasn't controlled by the advancing Soviet forces. The Soviets were conducting their own parallel operation, of course. The race was on. Whoever could secure the most German scientific talent would have an enormous advantage in the emerging Cold War. Both sides understood this with crystal clarity. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman signed off on what would eventually become Operation Paperclip. The name, chosen later, came from the paperclips that were used to attach new documentation to the scientists' files. Documentation that would help them enter the United States despite their Nazi backgrounds. Documentation that would, in many cases, obscure or outright lie about what they had done during the war. The official program would eventually bring approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America over the next decade. Some came immediately in the chaotic aftermath of surrender. Others were recruited more carefully, their backgrounds vetted, their value assessed. By the mid-1950s, they were scattered across the United States, working at military facilities, research laboratories, and the newly formed space agency. The most famous among them, the face of the program in the public imagination, was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been the technical director of the German rocket program at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. He had led the team that designed the V2, shepherding it from theoretical concept to operational weapon in just a few years despite constant resource shortages and Allied bombing. He was brilliant, charismatic, and ruthlessly pragmatic. When it became clear that Germany would lose the war, he made careful preparations to ensure that he and his key team members would surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. He got his wish. In May of 1945, von Braun and more than 400 of his colleagues surrendered to American forces in Bavaria. They brought with them truckloads of documents and 14 tons of V2 components that they had hidden in a mine shaft. And in return, America got the foundation of its space program. The story of what happened next has been told many times. Von Braun and his team were brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to Huntsville, Alabama. They taught American engineers everything they knew about rocketry. They redesigned and improved their V2. They developed new concepts. They dreamed of missions to Mars while building weapons for the Cold War. Von Braun would go on to design the Redstone rocket, which put America's first satellite into orbit. He would lead the development of the Saturn V, the massive 3-stage rocket that remains the most powerful machine ever successfully operated by humans. He would become the public face of American space exploration, appearing on television with Walt Disney, meeting with presidents, embodying the promise of American technological supremacy. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969, he did so on technology built by former members of the Nazi rocket program. The Saturn V that lifted Apollo 11 toward the moon had been designed under von Braun's leadership. The trajectory calculations, the staging procedures, the engine designs, all of it bore the fingerprints of Peenemünde. Other paperclip scientists made equally important contributions, if less publicly celebrated. Hermann Oberth, one of the founding fathers of rocketry whose theoretical work had inspired both von Braun and the Soviet program, came to America and continued his research. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen V2 production at the underground Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of slave labourers died, became a key figure in the Saturn program and received NASA's highest honour. Kurt Debus, who had managed rocket launches for the German military, and had been an active member of the SS, became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. Hubertus Strughold, whose work in aviation medicine had pushed the boundaries of human endurance in high-altitude flight, helped develop the protocols that would keep astronauts alive in the hostile environment of space. These men, and hundreds of others like them, formed the backbone of American aerospace achievement in the 50s and 60s. They trained a generation of American engineers. They solved problems that had seemed insurmountable. They turned science fiction into science fact. This is the story everyone knows. The story of redemption through science. The story of brilliant minds rescued from a fallen regime and given a second chance to serve humanity, to achieve the dreams that politics and war had interrupted. It's a compelling narrative. It's even mostly true. But it's not the whole truth. Because President Truman's order authorizing Operation Paperclip had included one explicit restriction, written in clear language that seemed to leave no room for interpretation. No one who had been involved in war crimes would be allowed entry to the United States. Active participants in Nazi atrocities, those who had ordered or overseen or participated in the horrors of the concentration camps, or the slave labour programs, or the medical experiments, these people would not be given safe harbour on American soil. On paper, this restriction was absolute and non-negotiable. In practice, it was routinely and systematically ignored. Dozens of the scientists brought to America under Paperclip had records connecting them directly to war crimes. Some had been members of the SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organisation, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Nazi regime. Others had held rank in the Nazi Party itself. Still others had overseen slave labour operations where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death building rockets and jet engines. Arthur Rudolph's Mittelwerk factory was a hell on earth, a subterranean nightmare where emaciated prisoners assembled V-2 rockets while guards beat them for working too slowly. More prisoners died building the V-2 than died from the weapons use against Allied cities. Rudolph oversaw it all, making production decisions that he knew would cost lives, meeting quotas that could only be achieved through slave labour. Hubertus Strughold conducted aviation medicine experiments that pushed human subjects to the limits of endurance and beyond. Some of his research had used data from Nazi experiments on concentration camp prisoners, experiments where subjects were frozen to death or killed in pressure chambers. Kurt de Boos had been an active and enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party and the SS. He had worn the uniform, attended the rallies, believed in the ideology. United States intelligence agencies, faced with the reality that the scientists most valuable to America's national security interests often had the most compromised backgrounds, simply rewrote their files. Incriminating documentation was removed or destroyed. Memberships in Nazi organizations were erased from the record. War crimes were attributed to others or dismissed as exaggerations. Clean histories were fabricated, complete with forged documents and coached testimony. The men came to America with pristine records, their past buried in classified archives, their crimes erased from official history. This is acknowledged fact now, not conspiracy theory. Declassified documents have confirmed it in exhaustive detail. Congressional investigations have exposed it. Journalists have written books about it. It remains controversial, a source of ongoing moral debate, but it's no longer secret. The question is asked again and again, should America have done this? Should we have given safe harbour to men who served Hitler, who used slave labour, who participated in the machinery of genocide? Should we have built our space program, our missile defence, our technological supremacy, on the backs of people who committed atrocities? These are important questions. They deserve serious consideration. The ethical compromise at the heart of Operation Paperclip is real and troubling. But perhaps the controversy focuses our attention in the wrong direction. Perhaps the debate about whether we should have brought Nazi scientists to America distracts us from a deeper, darker question. What if some of the Paperclip scientists weren't brought to America for the space program at all? What if there was a second track, running parallel to the public program? A shadow operation that never appeared in any official roster? Scientists whose work was too sensitive, too disturbing, too potentially explosive to ever be acknowledged? What if the 1,600 names we know about were just the surface? the acceptable face of a program that went much deeper. What if Evan Hartley really did find evidence of this in 1998, buried in a mislabeled box where it was never supposed to be found? And what if the reason those two men arrived so quickly, knew exactly what they were looking for, and removed it with such practiced efficiency was because this has happened before? Because there are people whose full-time job is to find these accidental exposures and make them disappear. Act 2. The specialists who don't exist. The first hint that Operation Paperclip might have been larger and stranger than the official history admits appears in declassified State Department cables from the late 1940s and early 50s. These documents, released piecemeal over decades in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, contain occasional references to something that shouldn't exist according to every published history of the program. They mention Category 2 paperclip specialists. The references are brief, usually just a line or two embedded in longer documents about other matters. A budget allocation for Category 2 specialists requiring special security clearances, a transfer order for Category 2 personnel moving between facilities, a request for additional housing at a military installation to accommodate incoming Cat 2 researchers. But nowhere in any public paperclip documentation, in any of the comprehensive rosters compiled by historians over decades of research, does the term Category 2 appear with any definition or explanation. The official paperclip rosters are remarkably complete. They contain approximately 1,600 names, each with an associated biography compiled from multiple sources: Nazi-era records, American military intelligence files, personnel documents from the various facilities where the scientists worked, immigration records, and in many cases interviews with the scientists themselves or their surviving family members. Each entry includes a birth date, place of birth, educational background, field of expertise, the German institution where they worked during the war, the American facility where they were first assigned, and a brief summary of their subsequent career. The rosters are cross-referenced, footnoted, and have been scrutinized by multiple researchers. They represent decades of painstaking historical work. None of these rosters mention a Category 2 designation. The scientists are all treated as part of a single program, with variations in security clearance and assignment, but no fundamental subdivision into separate categories. So who are these people mentioned in the State Department cables? A handful of researchers working on the margins of mainstream historical inquiry have attempted to track down the answer. What they've found is fragmentary, contradictory, and deeply strange. The pieces don't quite fit together, and there are enormous gaps where records should be but aren't. The Category 2 specialists, according to these scattered references, worked in fields that didn't fit the public narrative of Operation Paperclip. They weren't rocket scientists developing the next generation of missiles. They weren't aeronautical engineers designing swept-wing jet aircraft. They weren't chemists working on synthetic fuels, or physicists working on nuclear weapons. Their specializations, where they can be identified at all, included fields that sound more like science fiction than legitimate research: human sensory manipulation and control, electromagnetic behavioral research and modification, high-altitude survival experiments involving extreme conditions, neurological interference technology, cognitive enhancement through external stimulation protocols, psychotronic weapons development and field testing, non-local consciousness research and application. These are not the kind of specializations that help you build a rocket to the moon. These are the kind of specializations that suggest research into controlling human beings, influencing thoughts, manipulating perceptions, overriding will and choice. And according to the fragmentary records that mention them, these Category 2 specialists were not sent to NASA facilities or aerospace research centres. They went to military installations with higher security classifications, Department of Defense research laboratories that didn't appear on organisational charts, sites that had cover stories explaining their official purpose, while the real work happened in locked wings that required additional clearances. One location appears with unusual frequency in the scattered references that mention Category 2 specialists, a place called Camp King. Camp King was a real facility, and its history is not entirely secret. It sat in the Taunus Mountains near Frankfurt, Germany. occupying the grounds of a former Prussian military academy. During the American occupation of Germany after World War II, it served as a United States military intelligence site. The official cover was that Camp King handled routine intelligence processing, document analysis, debriefing of prisoners, coordination with other Allied intelligence services. Administrative work, basically, the kind of thing that any occupation force needs. But Camp King's real purpose was considerably darker. Under programs with anodyne code names like Bluebird and Artichoke, which would eventually merge into the infamous MK Ultra, the CIA conducted interrogation experiments at Camp King. They tested drugs on prisoners. They developed psychological techniques meant to break resistance. They explored methods of extracting information through means that went far beyond conventional questioning. The experiments conducted at Camp King in the late 1940s and early 50s would later be described in congressional testimony as torture. Prisoners were kept in isolation for weeks. They were subjected to sensory deprivation. They were dosed with experimental compounds that we now know caused permanent psychological damage. Some died, most were damaged, none consented. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact, confirmed by declassified CIA documents and congressional investigations. But there's one detail about Camp King that has never been fully explained. A declassified memorandum from February 1950, written by a CIA officer stationed at Camp King, mentions that paperclip researchers were assisting with interrogation enhancement work at the facility. The memo discusses scheduling difficulties, security protocols for the research staff, and requests for additional laboratory equipment. But the names of those paperclip researchers remain redacted in every released version of the document. Black bars cover their identities, their backgrounds, their specializations, their German affiliations, all of it hidden behind classification that has never been lifted. Who were they? What were they doing? What expertise could they possibly bring to interrogation research that the CIA couldn't develop on its own? The official answer, repeated in every response to Freedom of Information Act requests that have tried to uncover these names, is that the information remains classified for national security reasons. The identity of intelligence personnel, even personnel from programs that ended decades ago, cannot be revealed. But that explanation doesn't quite make sense. Thousands of CIA personnel from that era have been identified in declassified documents. Names of case officers, station chiefs, technical specialists, all released without apparent concern for national security. The names of paperclip scientists working on rockets and jet engines were never classified in the first place. So why do these particular names remain hidden? One theory, advanced by researchers who have spent years trying to piece together the fragments, is that these weren't ordinary paperclip scientists at all. They were the Category 2 specialists, people whose backgrounds were too sensitive to ever be revealed, because revealing them would expose the true nature of the program. Because if the official paperclip scientist had been involved in conventional war crimes, slave labour and weapons development, what had the Category 2 specialist been involved in? There's a pattern in the fragmentary evidence, a suggestion of purpose that emerges when you lay all the pieces side by side. These specialists weren't just helping with conventional interrogation techniques. They were bringing something new to the table, something that the Nazi regime had been developing in its final years as the war turned against them and desperate men pursued desperate measures. The Nazis had conducted extensive research into what we would now call psychological warfare and behavioural manipulation. Some of this was crude propaganda, the kind of thing any government does. But some of it went deeper, into experimental territory that combined genuine scientific research with pseudoscience and occultism. Experiments in hypnosis and suggestion. Research into the effects of electromagnetic fields on human nervous systems. Attempts to use drugs and sensory manipulation to create programmable soldiers. Wild theories about psychic influence and thought control. Most of it was garbage, the product of ideological thinking divorced from scientific method. But some of it, according to reports that filtered back to Allied intelligence during and after the war, had produced results. Unexpected results. Results that suggested it might be possible to influence human behaviour through means other than conventional persuasion or physical force. And if Operation Paperclip was fundamentally about capturing German scientific expertise before the Soviets could get it, then these specialists would have been among the highest priority targets, not for their ability to build weapons that could destroy cities, but for their ability to build tools that could control minds. The documents that Evan Hartley saw in 1998, if they were authentic, suggested exactly this. A parallel program hidden within the larger Paperclip operation, bringing scientists whose work could never be acknowledged to facilities where they could continue research that could never be revealed. Research into the human mind, into consciousness and perception, into the possibility of overriding free will itself, and if that research succeeded, even partially, then the implications are staggering. Because it would mean that somewhere in the classified history of American intelligence, hidden in archives that civilians like Hartley would never normally access, there's evidence that we learned how to manipulate human thought and behaviour in ways that go beyond anything the public has been told. It would mean that the real breakthrough from Operation Paperclip wasn't the Saturn V rocket. It was something far more dangerous. Act 3. Project Eclipse. The memorandum that Evan Hartley saw in that archive room in June of 1998, the one that two men from the Office of Special Investigations arrived to confiscate within hours of his discovery, contained a designation that appears nowhere in any declassified government records: Project Eclipse. No program by that name shows up in budget documents from the late 40s and early 50s. No personnel rosters, no facility assignments, no after-action reports or progress updates, no congressional testimony mentions it. No presidential finding acknowledges its existence. If it existed, it was buried deeper than anything that has been revealed in the decades of investigations and exposures that have gradually pulled back the curtain on Cold War-era intelligence operations. But the date on that memorandum, if Hartley's memory is accurate, is significant. October 21st, 1947. That was a pivotal moment in American intelligence history, a hinge point where multiple storylines converged. 3 months earlier, in July of 1947, something had crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. The official explanation was a weather balloon, part of a classified project to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The alternative explanation became the cornerstone of UFO conspiracy theory. But regardless of what actually happened at Roswell, the incident triggered a wave of interest in unconventional phenomena within the military and intelligence communities. Suddenly, questions that had seemed like science fiction were being taken seriously at the highest levels. In September of 1947, the National Security Act was signed into law, fundamentally reorganizing American intelligence operations for the emerging Cold War. The Act created the CIA, consolidated military intelligence services, and established the National Security Council. It represented a recognition that the United States needed permanent intelligence capabilities, not just wartime expedients. And if Hartley's document was real, then in October of 1947, someone was signing memoranda about continuing research where the Reich left off, about maintaining subjects off the record, about scientific potential outweighing public risk. The signature on that memo was supposedly Major General William J. Donovan. Donovan was a genuine American legend, a figure whose career seemed too dramatic to be real. He had won the Medal of Honor in World War I for leading his battalion through withering German machine gun fire, earning the nickname Wild Bill for his courage under fire. Between the wars, he had practiced law in New York and travelled extensively, developing connections with foreign intelligence services and thinking about how America might need to conduct espionage in a future conflict. When World War II began, Donovan lobbied President Roosevelt to create a centralized intelligence agency. Roosevelt agreed, and in July 1941, the Office of Strategic Services was born with Donovan at its head. He led the OSS through 4 years of war, building an organisation from nothing into an effective intelligence service that conducted espionage, sabotage, psychological warfare, and covert operations across multiple theatres. The OSS's achievements were real and significant. It had recruited Nazi defectors, supported resistance movements behind enemy lines, conducted daring operations that saved American lives. Donovan had built something impressive, but when the war ended, President Truman disbanded the OSS. Truman was suspicious of intelligence services, worried about creating an American Gestapo. He wanted military intelligence to return to the military services and civilian intelligence to be handled by the State Department and FBI. Donovan argued against this decision, warning that America would need coordinated intelligence capabilities in the peace that would follow. But Truman's mind was made up. In October 1945, the OSS ceased to exist. Donovan, disappointed and pushed aside, returned to his law practice in New York. That's the official story, the one in every biography and history book. Donovan retired from intelligence work, practiced law, gave occasional speeches about national security issues, but held no official position in the government after 1945. So why would he be signing classified memoranda about secret research programs in October of 1947? The simple answer is that he wouldn't. The document must be a forgery, someone trying to lend authenticity to a hoax by using the name of a famous intelligence figure. But there's a more complicated answer, one that researchers who have studied Donovan's post-war activities have uncovered. Donovan may have been officially retired, but he remained deeply connected to intelligence circles. He advised government officials on security matters. He maintained close relationships with former OSS personnel who had moved into the State Department, the military intelligence services, and eventually the CIA. He worked on classified projects through back channels, operating in the shadows without official title or acknowledgement. Donovan believed in the necessity of intelligence work, in the hard choices that had to be made to keep America safe. He was pragmatic about means and ends. He had ordered operations during the war that violated conventional morality because he believed they served a greater good. He had recruited people with compromised backgrounds, made deals with criminals and collaborators, overlooked ethical lines because winning the war mattered more than maintaining purity. If someone needed to run a program that was too sensitive even for normal classified channels, someone who would ask the right questions without worrying too much about the answers, Donovan would be exactly the kind of person you'd bring in. Someone with experience, connections, and a willingness to operate in moral grey areas. Someone who could make things happen without leaving official fingerprints. Someone who understood that some secrets need to stay secret forever. The memorandum that Hartley saw mentioned designated facilities where the Eclipse researchers would continue their work, separated from the main paperclip operation and hidden under deeper classification. Fragmentary evidence from Freedom of Information Act requests and occasional witness accounts suggest several possibilities. Wright Field in Ohio, which later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was a centre for aerospace research and development. It was also, according to persistent rumours, a repository for unusual materials and classified projects that didn't fit elsewhere in the military structure. The base was enormous, with hundreds of buildings spread across thousands of acres. It would be relatively easy to conduct sensitive research in one corner without anyone else knowing. Fort Detrick in Maryland was officially established as a biological warfare research centre in 1943. Its secure laboratories and isolation from public scrutiny made it an ideal location for sensitive experiments of any kind. If you needed to study things that most people would find disturbing, Fort Detrick offered both the facilities and the security to do it without observation. Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island was created in 1947, supposedly to conduct research into peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But its government funding, extensive security measures, and remote location could have covered work that had nothing to do with nuclear physics. And there are hints, buried in various documents and testimonies collected over the years, of an unlisted facility somewhere near Los Alamos, New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had established multiple secret sites around Los Alamos, some of which continued operating after the war under cover of nuclear weapons research. One of these sites, never officially acknowledged, may have hosted research that had nothing to do with atomic bombs. According to the conspiracy theory built from these fragments, Project Eclipse was focused on continuing and extending research that the Nazis had begun. Psychotronic weapons research. The idea was that electromagnetic fields, properly tuned and directed, could influence human nervous systems at a distance, make people feel fear or confusion, disrupt their ability to think clearly, perhaps even implant suggestions or commands, cognitive behaviour alteration through chemical and psychological means, finding combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and conditioning that could reshape how people think and perceive reality. Not crude brainwashing, but something more subtle and effective. Rapid learning induction, techniques for implanting information or skills directly into the brain, bypassing normal learning processes. The implications for military training would be enormous. Neurological dominance strategies, methods for overriding human will and decision-making, for making people carry out actions against their own interests without consciously recognising what was being done to them. Some of this sounds like pure science fiction, the kind of thing you'd see in a B-movie from the 50s. But research into these areas was very real during the Cold War, and some of it produced results that we're still trying to understand. The CIA's MKUltra program, which has been thoroughly documented through declassified records and congressional testimony, explored many of these same concepts. Between 1953 and 1973, MKUltra conducted hundreds of experiments on unwitting subjects. They dosed people with LSD and other psychoactive drugs, often without the subjects knowing. They researched hypnosis and suggestion. They explored sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. They sought methods of mind control that could be used against enemy agents, prisoners, or anyone else who needed to be controlled. The programme's excesses were finally exposed in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings, a series of congressional investigations into intelligence abuses. The testimony shocked the nation. CIA Director Richard Helms formally apologised. Reforms were implemented, files were declassified and made public. But the conspiracy theory surrounding Project Eclipse suggests something more disturbing. MKUltra wasn't the beginning of this research. It was the continuation. Or perhaps more accurately, it was the public-facing version. The programme that could be acknowledged if anyone asked too many questions, while the real research continued elsewhere under deeper cover. Eclipse, according to this theory, had started earlier, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. It had recruited the Category 2 paperclip specialists, who knew things that mainstream science hadn't discovered. It had given them facilities, funding, and subjects to experiment on. And it had achieved results that MKUltra scientists would spend decades trying to replicate. Then, something had gone wrong. An incident in May of 1953, catastrophic enough to force the programme's termination. At least the termination of Eclipse as it had existed up to that point. But the research didn't stop. It was reorganised, compartmentalised, hidden, under different names and different budget lines. Some of it may have been folded into MKUltra. Some may have continued under the Eclipse Continuity Division that Hartley saw mentioned on that briefcase. Continuity. Not closure, not completion. Continuity. As if the programme hadn't ended at all. As if it had simply gone deeper underground. Act 4. The Scientist with No Name. Among the fragmentary references to Category 2 paperclip specialists scattered across decades of partially declassified documents, one designation appears with unusual and troubling frequency. Researcher 47. Not a name, not even initials that might be cross-referenced against other records, just a number, stark and impersonal. Researcher 47 appears in classified budget documents from 1948, in facility transfer orders from 1949 and 1950, in what appear to be progress reports from 1951 and 52. His designation is always the same, never a name, always just the number. His field is listed variously, depending on which document you're looking at, as bioelectromagnetic interface systems, non-local cognition research, field-based neurological manipulation, and in one particularly cryptic entry, simply consciousness alteration through resonance protocols. These are not standard scientific disciplines. They don't correspond to any recognised academic department or research specialty. They sound more like concepts from science fiction than legitimate areas of inquiry. but the documents treat them as real, with funding allocations measured in tens of thousands of 1940s dollars, progress reports detailing experimental results, and security classifications that exceeded normal top-secret designations. The strange thing about Researcher 47, the detail that makes him different from every other scientist associated with Operation Paperclip, is that he seems to have no background, no history before appearing in American custody in 1947. Every other paperclip scientist, including even the Category 2 specialists where their names can be partially uncovered through research, has some kind of paper trail in Germany. University records showing where they earned their degrees, publications in scientific journals even if the journals were obscure, patent applications for their inventions, military service records from the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe, membership records from Nazi party organisations or professional societies. The Nazis were meticulous record keepers, maintaining detailed documentation on millions of people, and the Allied intelligence teams that swept through Germany in the months after surrender were equally thorough in documenting what they found. They photographed everything. They seized every archive they could locate. They interviewed thousands of people, but Researcher 47 has no German records, no birth certificate from any German municipality, no university enrolment at any German institution, no publication history in any German scientific journal, no military service record, even though virtually every German man of his generation would have been involved in military service or war work in some capacity. It's as if he didn't exist before appearing in American custody. Researchers who have tried to track down his identity have generated several theories to explain this absence. Perhaps his records were deliberately destroyed by the Germans before surrender, part of a last-minute effort to conceal the most sensitive programs. Perhaps he worked for one of the Nazi research programs so secret that they kept no formal documentation that might fall into enemy hands. Perhaps he was recruited from occupied territory outside Germany itself, from Poland or Czechoslovakia or Austria, and was given a German designation for administrative convenience. Or perhaps he was never German at all. This last possibility is the most disturbing, because it suggests something else entirely, something that would explain why his records are sealed more tightly than any other aspect of the program. If Researcher 47 wasn't a captured Nazi scientist, then what was he? One theory, advanced by researchers who have spent years studying the fragments and anomalies in the paperclip records, is that he was a joint creation, not a person brought from Germany, but someone whose identity was manufactured by the program itself. A test subject who became a researcher, someone whose background was erased deliberately because revealing it would expose the true nature of what was being done. The theory suggests that the Nazi scientists brought to America weren't just conducting research, they were conducting it on American subjects. Military personnel, perhaps, volunteers who didn't fully understand what they were volunteering for, or prisoners, people whose absence wouldn't be noticed or investigated, or patients from mental institutions, people who could be experimented on without consent because their testimony would never be believed. And perhaps one of those subjects turned out to be particularly receptive to whatever was being done, particularly talented at the skills being developed, so talented that he became part of the research team himself, his origins obscured behind a number designation, because the truth would be too explosive to ever acknowledge. This sounds paranoid. It sounds like conspiracy thinking taken to an extreme. But the history of classified research programs includes many instances where ethical violations that seemed unthinkable were later revealed to be real. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where black men were denied treatment for decades so researchers could study the disease's progression. Project MKUltra's dosing of unwitting Americans with LSD and other drugs. The CIA's operation of secret prisons where torture was routine and documented. Is it really so impossible that a program buried deeper than any of these, hidden behind multiple layers of classification and deniability, might have crossed even more fundamental ethical lines? The final reference to Researcher 47 appears in a CIA memorandum from May 1953. The memo, partially declassified in 1987 with significant redactions, describes what it calls an uncontrolled field resonance test resulting in personnel loss. The language is bureaucratic, almost antiseptic, The kind of careful phrasing that government agencies use when describing disasters they don't want to take responsibility for. But the implications are clear enough. Something went catastrophically wrong during an experiment. The memo includes a list of names, scientists who died in the incident, but the names are redacted, replaced with number designations. Researcher 33, Researcher 42, Researcher 59, and 7 others, 10 in total, killed in whatever happened on that May Day 70 years ago. But Researcher 47 is not among the dead. Instead, there's a separate notation, more disturbing than a simple death record would have been. R47 cannot be located. Full facility sweep completed. No remains recovered. No trace evidence found. Security review conducted. Recommend immediate termination of Eclipse program and redistribution of remaining personnel to alternative research tracks. Oversight to be assumed by Continuity Division pending final disposition. He had vanished. A handful of people working on the fringes of conspiracy research, people who study these fragments in their spare time while working ordinary jobs, have tried to find out what happened to Researcher 47 after May 1953. They've searched death records, immigration records, military personnel files, hospital records. They've looked for anyone who might match the few details that can be inferred from the documents. They found nothing. No death record. No subsequent employment anywhere in the government or private sector. No medical records. No trace in any database, no matter how obscure. Either he died in that incident and for some reason his body was never recovered or couldn't be identified, or he disappeared in some other way that left no trace. Or, according to the darkest version of the theory, the one that even most conspiracy researchers hesitate to voice out loud, whatever happened in that test succeeded in ways that the memo doesn't acknowledge. Whatever research was being conducted into consciousness and perception, and the alteration of reality itself, achieved some kind of breakthrough, and Researcher 47 became something that couldn't be recorded in conventional files, something that existed outside normal categories of life and death and identity. This is where the conspiracy theory crosses into pure speculation, untethered from any evidence or rational analysis. It's the kind of thing that makes serious researchers uncomfortable, the point where investigation into hidden history becomes science fiction or paranoid fantasy. But the speculation is worth noting because it reveals something about what people fear when they think about classified research into human consciousness. They don't just fear unethical experiments or violations of rights, they fear something deeper. They fear that some of this research might have actually worked. That somewhere in the classified history of intelligence programs, someone figured out how to fundamentally alter human consciousness, human perception, perhaps even human existence itself. And they fear that if it worked, it might still be working. That the capabilities developed in those hidden laboratories might still be in use, deployed against targets who would never know they were being manipulated, controlled, fundamentally changed from what they had been. Is an existential fear. Not just the fear of what was done to subjects in the past, but the fear of what might be being done to all of us right now. The fear that our thoughts might not be entirely our own, that our perceptions might be shaped by forces we can't detect, that free will itself might be something that can be overridden by the right combination of electromagnetic fields, chemical compounds, and psychological conditioning. These fears probably say more about our anxieties in the modern world than about any real capabilities that emerged from Project Eclipse or its successors. But the fragmentary evidence, the unexplained documents, the gaps in the record where something should be but isn't, these things feed the fears and keep the questions alive. Who was Researcher 47? What happened to him in May of 1953? And why, 70 years later, are his records still sealed more tightly than almost any other aspect of Cold War history? Act 5. The truth they'll never admit the incident in May of 1953, whatever it was, whatever really happened in whatever facility was conducting Eclipse research, appears to have been a turning point, a moment when something that had been controlled went out of control, when research that had been contained broke containment. All references to Project Eclipse in the fragmentary documents that can be found stop after that month. No more budget allocations in subsequent years. No more personnel transfers to eclipse-designated facilities. No more progress reports using eclipse terminology. The program seems to have simply ceased to exist, wiped from the record as completely as if it had never been there in the first place. But other things were happening in 1953 that provide context and raise more questions. 7 months after the eclipse incident, in November of that year, a CIA scientist named Frank Olson died after falling from a hotel window in New York City. Olson was a bacteriologist who worked at Fort Detrick on classified projects. The official story at the time was suicide, a tragic case of mental breakdown. Olson's family accepted this explanation, grieved, and tried to move on. 22 years later, in 1975, the truth began to emerge. Documents declassified as part of the Church Committee investigations revealed that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge, part of an MKUltra experiment. The drug had been slipped into his drink at a CIA retreat. Olson had reacted badly, becoming paranoid and disoriented. The agency had tried to manage the situation, but Olson's mental state deteriorated rapidly. A week after being dosed, he went through the window of his 10th floor hotel room. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it an accident during a psychotic episode? The truth has never been definitively established, but it became one of the most infamous casualties of the CIA's mind control research, a symbol of the ethical violations and reckless experimentation that characterized the program. The timing is suggestive. Olson died 7 months after the eclipse incident. Was there a connection? Did the catastrophic failure of one program lead directly to changes in another? Did eclipse personnel, fleeing from whatever disaster had occurred in May, bring their research into the MKUltra program that was just getting started? MKUltra was officially authorized in April of 1953, just weeks before the eclipse incident. It's possible that the two programs had overlapped, that Eclipse was running parallel to the early stages of MKUltra, perhaps exploring more extreme or exotic possibilities while MKUltra focused on more conventional approaches. It's also possible they were connected more directly. Perhaps Eclipse was a test bed, a place where the most radical experiments could be conducted before techniques were refined and transferred to MKUltra. Perhaps the Eclipse failure provided crucial data or warnings that shaped how MKUltra operated, teaching the CIA what boundaries couldn't be crossed without catastrophic consequences. Or perhaps, as some researchers have suggested, MKUltra was created specifically to be the public-facing version of research that was actually centered in Eclipse. A program that could be acknowledged, even if its details remained classified. The story they could tell if anyone asked too many questions about what was happening in certain facilities, what certain scientists were working on, where certain budget allocations were really going. While the real research, the research that had produced results too sensitive to ever reveal, continued elsewhere under deeper cover. This is pure speculation, unsupported by any direct evidence. But it fits a pattern that conspiracy researchers have identified in other classified programs, the existence of what they call sacrificial layers. Programs that are classified but deliberately discoverable, designed to absorb scrutiny and satisfy curiosity while protecting something deeper. The Manhattan Project is a good example. It was enormously secret during World War II, hidden behind elaborate cover stories and security measures. But after Hiroshima, it was revealed and gradually declassified. Books were written, documentaries were made, the story became public history. But aspects of the Manhattan Project remain classified to this day. Certain techniques, certain relationships, certain capabilities that were developed in the rush to build the first atomic bomb. These details stay hidden while the main story is told openly. MKUltra followed a similar pattern. It was exposed in the 1970s. Congressional hearings revealed its abuses and excessive experimentation. The CIA director formally apologized. Thousands of documents were released to researchers and the public. The story became known history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked intelligence agencies. But significant portions of MKUltra's files were destroyed before they could be subpoenaed. In 1973, when it became clear that congressional investigators were closing in, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. Most of the files were shredded or burned. What survived was damning enough. Proof of illegal experimentation, violations of human rights, reckless endangerment of innocent people. The documents that were released painted a picture of an agency that had lost its moral bearings in pursuit of mind control capabilities. But what was in the files that were destroyed? What was so sensitive that it couldn't be allowed to survive even congressional investigation? And through all the investigations and revelations and declassifications of the 70s, through all the testimony and leaked documents and journalistic exposés, Project Eclipse never came up. Not once. It was never mentioned in congressional hearings, never referenced in released CIA documents, never investigated by any official body, either because it never existed, because the handful of references that researchers have found in obscure corners of declassified documents are mistakes or misunderstandings or forgeries, or because it was protected by a level of security that MKUltra never had, because it represented research that went so far beyond MKUltra's experiments with LSD and hypnosis that it could never be revealed, not even in the wave of exposure that supposedly brought transparency to intelligence operations, because some secrets are kept secret forever. Epilogue. The signature that couldn't be 20 years after Evan Hartley saw that classified folder in the National Archives, after 2 men from the Office of Special Investigations had taken it away and warned him never to speak of it, he finally broke his silence. He was 68 years old by then, retired from government service for a decade, living quietly with his wife in a comfortable house in suburban Maryland. His children were grown and scattered across the country. He had grandchildren he doted on. He had a garden he tended and books he read, and a life that was, by any conventional measure, pleasant and peaceful. But he had never forgotten what he had seen that June afternoon in 1998. The photograph of von Braun with unknown men, the list of Category 2 specialists with their strange specializations, the Eclipse memorandum signed by a man who wasn't supposed to be signing anything in 1947, the final page ordering termination of civilian access and continuation of research off-site. And he had never forgotten the 2 men who had taken it away, particularly the older one with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing, who had warned Hartley that some things needed to stay buried. For 2 decades, he had kept his silence. He had followed the implicit command. He had told no one, not even his wife during their most intimate moments, not even his closest friends over drinks when conversation turned to mysteries and conspiracies and the hidden machinery of government. But in 2018, when Hartley was old enough to feel the weight of his years and brave enough not to care about consequences anymore, he decided to tell someone. Not a journalist who might sensationalize the story. Not an official investigator who would be bound by the same classification restrictions that had hidden Eclipse in the first place. But a researcher, a historian who had spent his career studying Operation Paperclip and who might understand the significance of what Hartley had seen. The researcher was a professor at Georgetown University named Thomas Kellerman. He had written 2 books about Paperclip, meticulously researched and carefully documented. He approached the subject with academic rigour but also with moral seriousness, neither excusing the ethical compromises nor reducing them to simple propaganda. Hartley had read both books and trusted Kellerman's judgment. They met in a coffee shop in Bethesda on a cold November morning. Hartley told his story slowly, carefully, trying to remember every detail. Kellerman listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, his face showing nothing except professional interest. When Hartley finished, Kellerman asked the obvious questions. Was he sure about what he had seen? Could he describe the documents in more detail? Did he remember the exact names on the list? What about the men who had taken the folder? Hartley answered as best he could. But his memory after 20 years was imperfect. He could recall the general content of the documents, but not their exact wording. He could describe the photograph but not identify the unknown men in it. He remembered the warning he'd received but not the precise language used. Kellerman thanked him for coming forward. He said he would look into it, file some freedom of information, act requests, see what he could find. He knew researchers who specialised in finding classified documents, people who understood how to work the system and extract information that was technically public but hidden behind bureaucratic obstacles. But Hartley could see in Kellerman's eyes that the professor didn't expect to find anything. The story was too strange, the documents too sensitive, the time too long past. They shook hands and parted. Hartley drove home feeling simultaneously relieved and disappointed. He had finally told someone. The secret no longer sat in his chest like a stone, but nothing would come of it. The truth would stay buried. Kellerman, for his part, did what he had promised. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any documents related to Project Eclipse. He searched for references to Category 2 paperclip specialists in every database he could access. He reached out to other researchers, to retired intelligence officers, to anyone who might have heard something about a shadow program running parallel to the main paperclip operation. He found nothing. Every FOA request was denied, either because no responsive records could be located, or because any such records that might exist remained classified for national security reasons. Every search came up empty. Every person he spoke with had never heard of Eclipse. It was as if none of it had ever existed. As if Hartley had imagined the whole thing, or had somehow misinterpreted what he had seen. But then Kellerman found something else. Not through official channels, not through any FOIA request or database search, but by accident while researching something entirely different. He was going through a collection of declassified OSS documents from the late 1940s, material that had been released years earlier and was available to researchers at the National Archives. He was looking for references to William Donovan's post-war activities, trying to establish what role, if any, the former spy master had played in early CIA operations, despite his official retirement. The documents were mostly routine, meeting minutes from various committees, budget proposals, administrative memos about personnel and facilities, the mundane paperwork that any organisation generates. But in a batch of files from 1948 concerning security procedures at Camp King in Germany, Kellerman found a memo that made his hands stop moving. The memo itself was unremarkable. It discussed updating background check procedures for staff assigned to secure facilities, establishing new protocols for compartmentalised access, routine bureaucratic process. The kind of document that survives classification review precisely because it contains nothing sensitive or interesting. But at the bottom of the final page was a signature, a handwritten name, slightly faded but still legible after 7 decades. William J. Donovan. The same signature, with the same distinctive angular style that Hartley had described on the Eclipse memorandum, the same signature that should have belonged to a man who had retired from government service in October 1945. Kellerman stared at it for a long time. Then he carefully photographed the page with his phone and sent a copy to Hartley with a simple question. "Is this the signature you remember?" Hartley called him 2 hours later. His voice was shaking. "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it. I remember the way the J crosses the W in the first name, the way the final N in Donovan extends below the line. That's the signature I saw." Kellerman felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because if the signature was authentic, and there was no reason to think it wasn't, since it was on a document that had been declassified through normal channels decades ago, then it proved something important. Donovan had been active in intelligence work in 1948 despite his supposed retirement. He had been signing documents related to Camp King, where according to later revelations some of the earlier CIA interrogation experiments were conducted. And if he was doing that, then it was entirely plausible that he might have been involved in other classified programs as well. Programs that went even deeper than what happened at Camp King. Programs like Eclipse. Kellerman wrote back to Hartley, asking if there was anything else he remembered, any detail he might have forgotten to mention in their original conversation. Hartley was silent for a long moment on the phone. Then he spoke quietly. "There is one thing," he said. "I didn't mention it before because it seemed too small, too unimportant. But when those men took the folder, when the older one put it in his briefcase, I saw a name tag. One of those leather luggage tags that people attach when they travel. It was just visible for a moment before he closed the case." "What did it say?" Kellerman asked. already knowing somehow that the answer would be important. Eclipse Continuity Division. The words hung in the air between them. Kellerman felt his skin prickle. Continuity, he asked. Not completion or closure. Continuity, Hartley confirmed. Like it was still ongoing. Like it was something that needed to be continued indefinitely. That conversation took place in January of 2019. 21 years after Hartley had found the folder. 66 years after the supposed incident that had ended Project Eclipse. 71 years after the program had allegedly begun. If the name tag was real, if Hartley's memory was accurate, then Eclipse wasn't just history. It wasn't just a program that had existed once and then ended. It was something that had continued, something that was still being protected, something that required its own division, its own organisational structure, just to maintain the cover-up and ensure that whatever had been discovered remained hidden. Kellerman filed one more, Freedom of Information Act request, this time specifically asking for any documents related to an Eclipse Continuity Division or any similar organisational entity within the Department of Defence or intelligence community. The response came 6 weeks later. A single-page letter on Department of Defence letterhead, signed by an official in the Office of Freedom of Information. The text was brief. A thorough search of relevant records repositories has been conducted. No records responsive to your request have been identified. The entity named in your request does not exist, and has never existed in any Department of Defence organisational structure. Further inquiries on this topic will not produce different results. Standard language, the kind of boilerplate response that government offices send to researchers who are chasing ghosts. Nothing unusual about it, except for one detail. At the bottom of the letter, below the printed signature, handwritten in blue ink in the margin, almost too small to read, were 3 words. Stop requesting this. Kellerman stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then he carefully compared the handwriting to the signature he had found on the 1948 memo. They matched. The same angular style, the same way certain letters were formed, the same pressure and flow. The handwriting that belonged to William J. Donovan, who had died in February of 1959, 60 years before this letter was written. Operation Paperclip brought 1,600 German scientists to America after World War II. They helped build rockets and satellites. They helped win the space race and establish American technological supremacy. They helped land men on the moon and expand the boundaries of human achievement. This is historical fact. This is confirmed by thousands of documents and hundreds of witnesses and decades of research. This is taught in schools and documented in archives and accepted by serious historians around the world. But what if those 1,600 were just the public story, the acceptable face of something larger and darker? What if there were others, scientists whose work could never be acknowledged, whose presence could never be recorded, whose research went into areas that touched on the fundamental nature of human consciousness and perception? What if the real breakthroughs weren't in rocket science at all, but in the science of controlling minds, the ability to manipulate thought, perception, behaviour, perhaps even the structure of reality itself as experienced by human beings? What if some of that research succeeded in ways we still don't understand and aren't meant to discover? And what if it never stopped? What if somewhere in the maze of classified programs and compartmentalized research and black budgets that disappear into bureaucratic labyrinths, the work that began with those Category 2 specialists in the late 1940s continues still, protected by layers of deniability and maintained by people whose full-time job is ensuring that no one ever asks the right questions? The official records say Project Eclipse never existed. There are no files, no budgets, no personnel rosters, just fragments and anomalies scattered across decades of declassified documents. Just stories from people like Evan Hartley, who saw something they shouldn't have seen and were warned never to speak of it. Maybe they're all mistaken. Maybe it's just conspiracy thinking, pattern making and random noise, the human tendency to see connections where none exist and create narratives from coincidence. Or maybe some secrets are kept so well that their very existence can be erased from history. Maybe there are programs so deeply classified that they leave almost no trace, maintained by people who understand that certain knowledge is too dangerous to ever be made public. Until someone finds a mislabeled box in an archive. Until someone asks a question that hits too close to something that should stay hidden. Until someone gets a response that they weren't supposed to get, written in handwriting that shouldn't exist. The truth about Operation Paperclip might not be about rockets at all. It might be about something far more disturbing and far more profound. Something that challenges our understanding of science, ethics, human consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Something that was never declassified because it can never be declassified. Because it's still happening. Somewhere in the shadow of government secrecy, in facilities that don't appear on any map, under programs that have no names in any public record, the research that began with those Category 2 specialists might still continue. The work of understanding and manipulating human consciousness, perception, thought itself. And if it does, if even a fraction of this is true, then the question isn't just what they discovered in those hidden laboratories 70 years ago. It's what they've become capable of doing with that knowledge in all the years since. What techniques they've refined, what capabilities they've developed, what boundaries they've crossed in pursuit of control over the human mind, and whether we would even know if they were using those capabilities on us, whether our thoughts are entirely our own, whether our perceptions of reality are authentic or shaped by forces we can't detect and wouldn't recognise if we could, whether free will itself, the fundamental assumption underlying all of human society and morality and law, is something that can be overridden by the right combination of technology and technique developed in programs that officially don't exist. These are the questions that the story of Project Eclipse raises. Questions that can't be answered because the evidence is sealed or destroyed. Questions that most people will dismiss as paranoid fantasy. But questions that won't go away as long as fragments remain, as long as witnesses break their silence, as long as researchers find documents that shouldn't exist and signatures that belong to dead men.